welcome our witness today, Commerce Secretary Ross. We deeply appreciate your service to the nation and grateful to you and everyone at the Department of Commerce for the job that you do. Today we're going to discuss the Department of Commerce's fiscal year 2018 budget request. Secretary Ross, we anticipate this will be a very tight budget year for the subcommittee and the Congress. We're all going to have to work to find efficiencies and fund the most important programs. I hope, Secretary Ross, that you can bring some of your innovative cost-saving ideas from the private sector to the Commerce Department. Help us make this department save our constituents very precious, scarce, and hard-earned tax dollars. You have proposed a lot of funding reductions across the department. We'll take a close look at all of them and see what makes sense. The Department of Commerce has several important missions, including preparing for and conducting the decennial census, enforcing our nation's trade laws, forecasting the weather, managing our fisheries, protecting and exploring our oceans, and administering our patent and trademark laws. The budget proposes reshaping the Commerce Department to focus on the highest priority missions. The limited resources available to the committee, we will work to make sure that you are appropriately addressing the most important key priorities, such as ensuring that the 2020 census will cost less than the 2010 census, making certain that weather satellite programs meet their cost and schedule timelines, and strengthening cyber and IT security at the department, an ongoing and serious problem in the 21st century. Before we proceed, Mr. Secretary, I would like to recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Serrano, for any opening statements he'd like to make.
I just want to know, is this the hearing that we were supposed to conduct all in Spanish? Not this one.
That's the one tomorrow.
Tomorrow. The Department of Commerce is vital in promoting job creation and opportunity for all. In doing so, it must ensure that we have fair trade in which American workers are protected and well compensated. As part of that effort, we must also make sure that other countries enforce labor laws and environmental regulations that help us combat climate change, the very things that undermine fair trade if not done correctly. In addition, the department promotes sustainable development and improves standards of living by working in partnership with numerous stakeholders. The President's budget request for fiscal year 2018 includes a $7.8 billion for the Department of Commerce, which is $1.4 billion or 15% decrease from the 2017 enacted level. This level of funding endangers these core missions at the department. This budget very foolishly eliminates, in my opinion, vital agencies and zeroes out important programs. For example, it eliminates Economic Development Administration grants and the Minority Business Development Agency. EDA is a business development only agency across a federal government that focuses exclusively on economic development in economically distressed areas around the nation. In addition, MBDA promotes the growth of minority-owned businesses and helps them compete in the world economy. I strongly oppose the elimination of these two agencies because it will hurt small businesses, workers, and economically distressed areas. The President's budget's blueprint for 2018 also seeks to zero out funding for the Manufacturing Extension Partnership, or MEP. It is estimated that for every $1 of federal investment, the MEP National Network generates $17.90 in new sales growth for manufacturers and $27 in new client investment. A survey by the Upjohn Institute in cooperation with the MEP Center showed that the MEP program helped create and retain more than 80,000 jobs in 2015 alone. In short, this program enhances the productivity and competitiveness of small and medium-sized manufacturers and creates a well-paying jobs while reducing our trade deficit with other countries. In addition to these cuts, the Trump administration proposes to zero out funding for various NOAA grants and programs that support coastal and marine management, education and research, and benefiting industry as well. States and local stakeholders are also involved. The Regional Coastal Resiliency Grants, for instance, ensures our states and communities are prepared to face changing ocean conditions, from acidification to sea level rise, as well as major catastrophes. We need to make sure that we help our coastal areas. We need to make sure that we help our coastal communities remain resilient in the face of climate change and allow NOAA's research programs to continue. This is necessary for America's economic and environmental health. With regard to the Census Bureau, a very important constitutional mandate. As I stated a couple of weeks ago at our hearing with Director Thompson, the proposed funding level falls short of what is needed to help ramp up the ongoing preparations for both the 2020 census and the other important surveys conducted by the Bureau. In fact, your requested total is actually $136.6 million below President Obama's request for the previous year. Fiscal year underfunding and delays in enactment of the Bureau's budget have already had consequences, and I remain seriously concerned that the Bureau won't be able to match the historic levels of compliance from the 2010 census. This is a critical time for the Census Bureau, and the leadership vacuum in combination with this budget request imperils a successful decennial census. These proposals in total represent a betrayal of many of the very individuals who voted for President Trump, individuals who reside in areas that are hurting economically and that are greatly helped by the programs this budget seeks to eliminate. However, Mr. Chairman, I remain confident, and I want to say this to you personally because of our relationship, that I mean this sincerely. I and my staff want a bipartisan approach, want to be able to do the best for the Commerce Department, because if they succeed, America succeeds. So there will be times when we disagree. It may fall apart. Who knows? It's democracy. But my intent is to work with you to come up with a bill that we can be proud of. Thank you.
We have always worked together beautifully, and we're starting in the right place, and look forward to finding a way to do that in the weeks ahead. It's my privilege to recognize a gentleman from New Jersey, our full committee chairman, Mr. Frelinghuysen, for any remarks he'd like to make.
Thank you, Chairman Culberson, and welcome Secretary Ross to the Appropriations Committee. Today's hearing is an important part of the oversight duties of the committee, and now we have formally received the administration's budget, and I can assure you we will go through each and every budget, including yours, line by line, question witnesses, your good self and others, representatives of the department, and demand credible spending justifications, and only then will we make our own determinations on the best use of tax dollars. The Department of Commerce, of course, serves as a voice of America's businesses, and in my home state of New Jersey, your department plays an integral role in promoting job creation and creating more economic opportunities. It is imperative that we continue to make smart investments that protect American companies from unfair trade practices, help foster and grow domestic manufacturing, and promote U.S. innovation and industrial competitiveness, and deliver more U.S. products to international markets. In a larger sense, many of my colleagues are concerned that certain sections of your budget suggest that America may be stepping back from many of its international relationships and responsibilities. I, for one, am concerned about the optics of a possible retreat into isolationism and protectionism. What I do know, and I think we all know, we cannot isolate ourselves and expect the vacuum not to be filled by the Chinese and others. We've seen that in the military aspect of what we're doing in the Middle East. If you step back, the vacuum is filled by bad characters who will take that economic edge away from us. But we're very pleased to have you here this morning, and I thank Chairman Culberson for the opportunity to address you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Ross, we're delighted to have you here today. Your written statement will be entered into the record in its entirety if there's no objection. And so we recognize you for your opening statement. And if you could keep your statement to within 5 minutes, that'd be appreciated. Thank you, sir.
Oh. It's on.
There you go. Now.
Were people able to hear what I'd been saying, or do I need to start back? Oh, it seemed to me like everybody was following. Anyway, the President's budget request prioritizes and protects investment in core government functions. These include ensuring fair and secure trade, preparing for the 2020 decennial census, and providing the satellites necessary to produce timely and accurate weather forecasts. The budget also reduces or eliminates often duplicative or redundant grant programs. The administration is devoting resources toward making critical investments in our nation's economic and military securities. The President's budget provides an additional $4.5 million to the International Trade Administration for its enforcement and compliance section. These resources will be directed towards the self-initiation of anti-dumping and countervailing duty investigations. We will ensure that no country or foreign corporation can take unfair advantage of U.S. markets. This budget will create 29 new positions to accelerate these cases and shield U.S. businesses which are concerned about retaliation. President's budget also provides $1 million increase in funding for the Bureau of Industry and Security. The requested funding will add 19 new special agents within BIS's export enforcement offices across the United States. BIS, despite its current size of only about 120 special agents, punches far above its weight in defense of our country. In March, we announced a combined civil and criminal fine of $1.19 billion against ZTE, the second largest Chinese telecommunications company, for illegally shipping sensitive equipment to Iran and North Korea. BIS took the lead in cracking this case open. So I'm confident that these 19 additional agents and the bandwidth they represent will have real impact. The President's 2018 budget also requests $1.5 billion for the U.S. Census Bureau, a 2% increase from the 2017 omnibus funding level. This is a recognition of the important work that the Department of Commerce does in fulfilling its constitutional responsibilities of the executive branch. The President's budget funds key activities that prepare for the 2020 decennial census and in support of the Bureau's other data collection functions. As you are well aware, the Census Director has reported a large cost overrun in one area of the operation. The Commerce Secretariat and the OMB are jointly cross-checking these numbers. In addition, we are retaining outside consultants to conduct a third-party review. We hope to have more clarity on this issue soon. The 2018 fiscal year budget also proposes $4.8 billion for the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration. NOAA's budget is tailored to fund its core missions of data collection and environmental stewardship. Within NOAA's top line, $1 billion is recommended for the National Weather Service. Funding is also included for the Advanced Weather Interactive Processing System cyclical refreshment. This reduces the risk of system downtime that can impede critical weather forecasts and warnings. With its $1.8 billion request for the National Environmental Satellite and Data Information Service, NESDIS, NOAA will continue its work to deploy the next generation of weather satellites. These items are just a small cross-section of our department's overall budget. I hope I have given you a glimpse into the priorities set by President Trump and the administration. I'm glad for the opportunity to get into more detail with you and to provide answers for any specific questions you may have. Thank you.
Mr. Secretary, thank you. I want to particularly commend you for the focus you've, as you indicated in your testimony, on the International Trade Administration to address the growing. Yep. We're delighted to be joined by our ranking member, the gentlewoman from New York, and I would be pleased to recognize her for any statement she'd like to make at this time.
Well, thank you very much, and I am really excited to see you again, and I wish you the best in your new responsibilities, and I thank you so much for joining us today. As you noted in your written testimony, the Department of Commerce's mission is to ensure that taxpayer dollars go to programs that will grow the economy, and that's why your budget's elimination of the Economic Development Administration, which helps struggling communities, doesn't make any sense, and I hope we can have further discussion on that. I would say that investments in scientific and environmental advancements that keep our coastal zones and marine wildlife safe also have an important economic impact. Given this administration's aversion to science, unfortunately, especially when it comes to climate change, your proposed eliminations of the NOAA National Sea Grant Program and the NOAA Coastal Zone Management Grant Program may not be a surprise, but combined with significant decreases to NOAA climate research and NIST, these cuts are dangerous. We need research to understand the changes in the environment and weather patterns that put our communities safe and economies at risk. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. I could name a litany of natural disasters for which we could have been better prepared to mitigate damage. Superstorm Sandy, for example, destroyed homes, businesses, transportation hubs, and shorelines along the eastern shore, including in my district. The federal government provided $60 billion to help communities recover and rebuild. Why in the world would we impede research to help us understand and prepare for the havoc our changing environment could wreak on our communities in both lives and treasures? Finally, I must note, while this budget includes an increase for the Census Bureau, it is shockingly insufficient with 2020 looming. We need an accurate and full picture of the population to understand how to best serve the American people across every federal department agency. Mr. Secretary, I look forward to a productive discussion this morning, and I look forward to working with you to achieve the department's goal. And Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you so much. As the chairman knows, we've had our roller skates on today. There are so many hearings. Thank you very, very much for giving me the opportunity.
Thank you, Mrs. Lloyd. Delighted to have you with us, and it's always a pleasure to work with you. Mr. Secretary, I truly do want to thank you for focusing on anti-dumping and countervailing duties, and want to congratulate the department in particular for that long overdue and very important $1 billion civil and criminal fine that was imposed on ZTE. That's extraordinarily important. The Chinese have been notorious in this area, and I'm really grateful to you for that work, and congratulate the agents in
Thank you, sir.
the department that took care of that. If I could, Mr. Secretary, start with the census. We had a hearing earlier this month with the Census Bureau, and they testified that their IT systems would be 48% over budget, which is just not acceptable. I wanted to ask you what you'll do to hold census employees and contractors accountable for that cost breach, and what steps you're taking to keep the cost of the 2020 census under control while preserving your ability to perform that vitally important function.
Surely. Well, the first thing we're trying to do is to get our arms around what the real numbers are likely to be. We have put together a task force consisting of folks from the Secretariat and from OMB, plus 2 outside consultants with great deal of experience in prior censuses, so that we can begin to identify what caused the huge overrun that's already been reported, what are the implications for potential future further overruns, because that was just one segment that accounted for it. In general, the contracts that the Census Bureau has put out have tended to be time and material contracts. And my experience in private sector has been, when that is the case, and when you have very complicated situation with a large number of vendors and the necessity to integrate them into a very massive, basically software activity, the potential for trouble is really quite considerable. And it's alarming that at this relatively early stage, when only a small portion has actually been spent, they already are calculating very major overrun in the back end of it. So we're going through the entire series of activities that'll be conducted, trying to get 2 things in mind. One is most probable budget course or budget requirement, and then the other is an outside parameter. How bad could it get if really things get totally out of control? And then once we have those 2, what we will be working on is what is it that can be done on a remedial basis in each of the various phases that are yet to be done to try to bring it back under control. Our primary objective, though, is an accurate enumeration of the population, and we do not intend to sacrifice that at all. And if it is going to cost more, we will come to you, we'll explain why, and we will try to work with you on solutions. I'm just getting up to speed on all these contracts because, as you know, they were entered into long before my time here. So other than those 40,000-foot observations for the moment, we will get to ground zero, and we will report quite promptly once we do.
I have faith you'll get to the bottom of it, and I just want to assure you that I'll work with you this committee will work with you to be sure that you've got the tools you need to hold people accountable and to do what's necessary to help control the cost of the census while ensuring its accuracy. That's a vitally important role of the department. We're expecting votes about 11:30, so I'm going to cut my time a little short, 11:15, 11:30, and recognize Mr. Serrano so we can move along.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, sir.
The President's budget request includes $800 million for 2020 census preparations. While this is an increase above the current level, it is still a full $121 million below the amount that the Commerce Department had earlier projected would be needed for fiscal year 2018. The department is now planning on delaying the opening of regional offices and other issues that we need to set up. Secretary, how can such an inadequate budget request for the 2020 census be justified? And won't it eventually lead to a situation where the census, in fact, will cost more, and how can we fix that? Because as you know, the census is one of the perhaps few areas which is constitutionally mandated. We need to do it. We need to get a good count. It helps all the states. It helps all our members, but we don't seem to be ready to do it, nor do we seem to be able to pay for it properly. And secondly, having a vacuum at the leadership position also adds to the problem.
Well, that's a whole bunch of questions, sir. I'll try to answer them as best I can. I'm committed to being transparent, totally transparent with this committee regarding the financial requirements of the 2020 census. And as soon as we really do have a good handle, whether it's more, less, whatever it's going to turn out to be, we will promptly come back to you with our detailed backup for why we're making the requests that we're making. So rest assured of that. Rest assured also, I have a historic reason for being very interested in the census, in that when I was working my way through Harvard Business School, I was a census taker. I literally was an enumerator with the big white belt and the badge going around Scully Square in Boston. And so I understand quite a little bit about the groundwork that's needed to be done. And I also understand a little bit how hard it is to manage that kind of a workforce. You're talking about hiring hundreds of thousands of part-time people who know they're part-time, know that there's no permanent career opportunity. So just creating, hiring, and managing that kind of a force in all over the country and in the territories, dealing with Native American reservations, it's a very, very daunting and very complex task. So I don't think I will be underestimating the magnitude of either its importance or the magnitude of the challenge. But as we sit here at this moment, I don't have a totally reliable figure for you. When I come back, it'll be a figure I can stand behind.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, do I have time for another question?
We're going to try to follow the 5 minutes. You got a minute. You're good shape.
Well, this is a longer question. Mr. Secretary, I have a number of questions about the administration's budget request. But before we get to that, I need to address something related to the cloud that is currently hanging over much of the federal government right now, and that is the investigation into Russian interference in 2016 presidential election. Earlier this year, numerous members of Congress sent you written questions related to the Bank of Cyprus and its Russian investors. First, why has the White House refused to permit the release of your written responses to these questions? Secondly, are you concerned that the White House refusal to release your answers contributes to the concern expressed by many Americans over the White House refusal to address the testimony by current and former intelligence officials that Russia did in fact interfere in the 2016 elections?
Well, I am aware of the letters that were sent by various members of Congress and had discussed that as part of the confirmation proceedings. What the White House decision-making was, I can't tell you why, but that was the position. Rest assured, though, the New York Times, which is not normally a big friend of this administration, did a very thorough investigative study of my own situation vis-a-vis Bank of Cyprus and Russia, and they came away with a very affirmative conclusion in terms of me not having any real involvement. So I hope that gives you some degree of comfort in the situation.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Chairman Verliegenheisen.
In my earlier life, I was in Mr. Serrano's position as the ranking. It's better to be in the majority situation, I think. Let me say, I commend you for taking a look at the census. It really begs the question, what's been going on over there since the last census? I mean, it's an expensive endeavor, and I think much of American business obviously depends on a lot of the information that's collected. I know you're acutely aware of that. And lastly, I'd like to put a plug in. I've always thought that NOAA has done an incredible job. I'm reminded that 72% of the world's surface is water, so it's important that we be aware of all aspects that relate to it. And I want to put a plug in for NIST. Sometimes in the overall scheme of things, there are a lot of acronyms, but they do some remarkable things too, and I've always viewed it as sort of one of the crown jewels that's out there, especially now because they have this sort of initiative on cyber, which I think affects just about every part of our nation. But certainly, you know that in the final analysis, this House is going to put its imprint on your recommendations, and we obviously will do that respectfully and look forward to working very closely as we move ahead. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, sir.
Ms. Loewy.
Thank you very much. And where our chairman left off, I'd like to say that I look forward to working with the chairman and all my colleagues in producing a really good bill as we did in 2017. So to my question, Mr. Secretary, you are proposing to eliminate the NOAA Sea Grant program, which received $63 million in the recently passed fiscal year 2017 spending bill. Its national network of colleges and universities conducts scientific research in support of the conservation and practical use of the coast, the Great Lakes, and other marine areas. There are several universities and research institutions in our home state, New York, that are part of this network. In fact, I'd love to take you at some point to Columbia University's Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, but so are a number of universities in other states that voted for President Trump because they believed that he would deliver for their economies: Ohio, Wisconsin, Michigan, Florida, North Carolina, and others. If the Sea Grant program is eliminated, as President Trump proposes, these states will lose this very valuable program. This doesn't make sense to me, and if you would comment on this, I would really be appreciative, and I'd love to take you to Lamont Doherty one day.
Well, if permitted by the Office of Government Ethics, I will take up your invitation to go there. In terms of the substance of it, the administration's 2018 budget prioritizes rebuilding the military and making critical investments in the nation's security. It also identifies the savings and efficiencies needed to keep the nation on a responsible fiscal path. To meet those goals, some difficult decisions needed to be made. The administration prioritized programs that provide a good return to the taxpayer, as well as those that serve the most critical functions, while consolidating or eliminating duplicative, ineffective, or less critical programs. The Sea Grant program is a successful program, but it's one that primarily benefits industry, state, and local stakeholders. Those programs are a lower priority than the core functions maintained by the budget, such as surveys, charting, and fisheries management.
Let me just say that I look forward to having you visit this program because although some wisdom may come from some in the administration, I think that analysis is misguided because if you look at the creation of jobs, the Sea Grant program is absolutely key. So I thank you very much, and I hope we'll move on because I'll save my other questions for another day. But we really have to analyze each of these programs, and the person who briefed you may not be aware of the job-creating opportunities and the knowledge we gain from these outstanding programs. So I look forward. I'll take you up on your acceptance. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Loy. It's my privilege to recognize the chairman of the full committee in the last Congress and former chairman of this wonderful subcommittee, the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Rogers.
Thank you for being here. Congratulations on your elevation to this post, or demotion as the case may be. So good luck to you. Recently, U.S. steel companies have had to close plants and lay off their employees at an alarming rate due to unfair trade practices. In December of 2015, AK Steel temporarily laid off about 700 employees at Ashland, Kentucky, just outside my district. And AK Steel pointed out that one of the reasons for that temporary layoff was, quote, the onslaught of unfairly traded imports, end quote. AK and several other domestic steel producers filed a complaint with the International Trade Administration and the International Trade Commission at Commerce. And in 2016, Commerce imposed a 209% duty on imported Chinese corrosion-resistant steel and levied separate anti-dumping duties on hot-rolled steel products from 7 other countries. And then in March of this year, ITC determined that companies under de facto Chinese government control had in fact sold stainless steel sheet in the U.S. at far less than market value, injuring U.S. companies, and they imposed a 58% duty on these Chinese products. But the AK Steel plant is still idling. It's Ashland Furnace, as are many of the other steel companies. Now, we increased, in recent years, this committee provided several funding increases for the ITA Enforcement and Compliance Division. And I'm pleased to see that the President's request in his budget continues this trend with an additional $3 million. Question is, how do you plan to spend that money and stop this insidious wasting of American jobs?
Thank you, sir. Well, as you're probably aware, I'd spent a good deal of time in the steel industry myself with International Steel Group and Bethlehem Steel and LTB and some others. So I'm acutely aware of how we got to where we are. What we're doing is a number of things. We have stepped up the pace of enforcement. Already, the department has outstanding almost 400 cases. I think it's around 389 or 390, about half of which alone relate to steel, and about half of those relate to Chinese as one of the participants. So we're very much focused on both the geography and the magnitude of the problem. And just yesterday, we held a hearing under Section 232, exploring the national defense and national economic security implications of the steel situation. And it was a very, very interesting day. We had 37 separate witnesses come to testify. Steelworker Union, just about all the American producers, some of the consuming industries, and interestingly, several representatives of foreign governments, Chinese government, Russian government, Ukrainian government, and maybe one or two others testified that they did not feel that there was any national defense or economic security implication to steel. The domestic people, by and large, took a quite different view. So where we stand on it is we have been studying it within the department for quite some little while since the executive order. We've now had the hearing. We have allowed another week for written submissions beyond those that have already come in. Once we've had a chance to digest yesterday's oral testimony plus the written, we will complete our report. We will recommend to the President whatever course of action the facts suggest, and then he will make his decision. we technically have 270 days to do it. We're not going to take anything like that. Sometime during the month of June, I expect we will render the report, and my guess is the President will act very quickly on the report once it's submitted.
Well, as the gentleman knows, steel is the backbone of American industry. So many other types of industries feed off it, such as coal in my district.
Right.
And of course others. So we wish you well in your job in pushing these proposals to stop this insidious wasting of American jobs. We want to make steel great again.
Yes, sir. Well, steel is very important to national defense, even though it's only a small percentage of total steel production. It's the same mills that make steel for civilian purposes that make it for military purposes. The famous big bomb that was let loose in Afghanistan would not have been able to do the job without a lot of steel. Neither would the Navy have ships, neither would the Air Force have planes, neither would the Army have tanks or armored personnel carriers or rifles or anything. So steel, while it is not a military use right now, is not a huge component, it really is an essential ingredient, and particularly the higher quality special alloys of it are extremely important from the point of view of armor for vessels, armor for vehicles, armor for everything. So we are focusing quite intently on it, and the questions we posed to the people who testified yesterday were, one, do they agree that it is a national emergency? Two, if it is, what is it we should do? Should it be tariffs? Should it be quotas? Should it be some combination of the two? Should it be very broadly based, covering a whole multitude of steel products? Should it be more narrowly focused? How should we deal with the relationship in steel between the U.S. and its two immediate neighbors, Canada and Mexico? We actually have steel surplus with Canada and Mexico. So that puts them in a little different position, as well as the fact that they are participants in NAFTA. So my reason for going into that detail is this is a very serious, and it is the first systematic study of the real implications of the import problem, the global overcapacity on steel. And that will be followed up very shortly with our response to the President's other executive order about aluminum. We're going to be conducting a very similar study on aluminum, and there may well be other industries that need the same treatment. If it comes to an affirmative finding, 232 gives the President very broad power as to the kinds of remedies that he might impose. So that's one of the merits of using that very rarely used provision in the 1962 Act. So we are on board with that investigation, but we're not letting up on the normal enforcement matters. And in fact, recently, we did a case called Chinaris, in which the problem wasn't steel as such. Oh, my overtime?
They just called a vote, Mr. Secretary.
Oh, my goodness. Well,
So excuse me, but we're probably going to need to, we've got 12 minutes in the vote. If someone would like to try to get another question very quickly, then we'll recess and come back. Forgive me for interrupting, because you're talking about something we are all in agreement on, focusing on the strategic importance of our steel industry and protecting it in the United States. We thank you very much for it. Mr. Cartwright, if you could be brief, we will recognize you, and then we'll recess and come back, Mr. Secretary. So excuse me for interrupting you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Ross, welcome to our subcommittee. I'm Matthew Cartwright from northeastern Pennsylvania. My hope is that you share my commitment to the goal of creating and preserving family-sustaining jobs in our economy. Something that's horribly troubling to me is that the administration proposes the complete elimination of the Economic Development Administration, the EDA, one of our greatest job creators in this nation. I believe, if anything, we need to expand the work of the EDA to help the communities that need it most. For example, the past 2 budget proposals from the administration included a Power Plus plan, which would focus money on communities that have been hurt by the contraction of the coal communities. I'm proud to be the lead Democrat on a bill called the Reclaim Act, introduced by former Chairman, Representative Hal Rogers here, and Senator McConnell, a brilliant piece of legislation that would inject $1 billion to benefit those communities. Mr. Secretary, will you support the Reclaim Act and similar efforts to inject funding and help create jobs where they are needed most?
The administration is committed to bringing jobs back and to building jobs here in existing businesses. And I very, very much share his commitment to those activities. And a lot of the reason why we have become so much stricter in enforcement than had been true before is that's where a lot of the problems are coming from, is from dumping of product. You have, say, the steel industry, there's a global overcapacity that is, the unused excess capacity is several times total U.S. consumption, so it dwarfs our whole economy. So we really need that.
Well, thank you for that. I want to move on to manufacturing, which I think is one of the keys to creating and preserving family-sustaining jobs. Mr. Secretary, the administration proposes eliminating all federal funding to the Manufacturing Extension Partnership, the MEP, as was originally intended when the program was established, they said, but in 1998, Congress changed course and has continued to appropriate funding for MEP in every single subsequent year in strong bipartisan fashion. MEP centers need federal support because they serve manufacturers that are too small to attract private sector investment. Over 60% of MEP beneficiaries cite MEP centers as their only resource for technical expertise. Now, my question is, a full 85% of Department of Defense awards go to smaller manufacturing firms. This is the very market the MEP program serves. Have you analyzed the potential threat to DoD's manufacturing and readiness needs if you eliminated the program that allows DoD suppliers to be more productive, efficient, and innovative?
Well, as I mentioned, this budget unfortunately has to be about priorities, and the MEP has certainly performed a good function. We believe that even with the elimination of federal funding, the MEP centers would transition to non-federal revenue sources, which, as I understand it, was actually originally intended when the program was first established, that it would eventually transit to non-federal sources.
Could you be specific on what the plan is for transitioning to non-federal sources?
Well, they have partnerships with a number of local institutions, as I think you're aware. We believe that there is community support for funding coming from private sector to them. We certainly don't mean to imply that manufacturing is not critical. It is. We understand that. But you have to make difficult choices when you're in a budget stringency period. And unfortunately, this is one of the choices that had to be made.
We're running pretty tight. We'll come back.
I yield back, Mr.
Thank
Chairman.
you. Thank you very much, Mr. Cartwright. Recognize Judge Carter.
Secretary Ross, welcome. Thank you for being here. I chair DHS Subcommittee on Appropriations, and I often hear about threats we face concerning cybersecurity, and actually the outright theft of intellectual properties and the growing cybersecurity threat we face concerning our critical infrastructure, such as the grid. Tell us about what changes you're making in cybersecurity realm to protect our critical infrastructure, and we've seen general nods to increase cybersecurity and tightening of intellectual property security in the budget. How can American business, especially small and medium enterprises, expect to see these initiatives working for them?
Well, as you know, part of the Department of Commerce function is to take a leading role in the interagency activities relating to cybersecurity. That is a problem that I think will be with us for the rest of our lives and our grandchildren's lives. It's a never-ending struggle to try to keep pace with or even get a little bit ahead of the hackers. You saw this very recent instance on a huge, huge scale. This is a very serious problem. We take it very seriously, and I feel that the work that the people within Commerce are doing is very, very valuable to it. I think they are acknowledged as playing a leadership role along with Homeland Security, along with other entities of the government in doing so. And they will continue those efforts. We're very, very supportive of that.
Do you feel like that small business and medium-sized businesses are being considered? Because we know that the targets and the big target areas out there make the news, but the reality is those smaller entities have less ability to secure their own information.
No,
and it would seem to me that would be something that you'd have to be challenged by.
Yes, that is certainly true. It's also true, though, that some of the hackers are more interested in getting blackmail money or protection money, and so they tend to go after the larger targets because there's a bigger check that they can get for the same hacking. So it is a problem for the small business, and it's something we're very aware of, and so is the Small Business Administration. Secretary McMahon as well. It is a struggle we're going to have every day as we go forward, and we're doing the best we can to cope with it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Judge. Mr. Terry, I think we'll recess at this time because votes down to the last 3 minutes. There are so I don't expect it to be too long, and we will come right back into sessions. For that, the committee stands in recess. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman.
The hearing will come to order. Ms. Ming, you're next, but if I could, I'd like to briefly recognize our ranking member, Mr. Serrano, for a brief statement.
Mr. Secretary, don't be shocked, but I'm going to praise you for something. You're the first, I've been in Congress 27 years, and you're the first secretary to mention the territories. I was born in Puerto Rico without having to be prodded by me to mention the territories. So I appreciate that personally. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman.
Mr. Serrano's a true gentleman. Ms. Ming, pleased to recognize you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here today, and congratulations as well. I wanted to follow up on questioning about the census. As you know, Director Thompson recently retired from the US Census Bureau. Where are you in the process of hiring a new director?
Well, we've been actively recruiting, and we would welcome any suggestions that members of this committee might have as to who would be a good successor. We're looking both within census and outside census to try to find both the director and the deputy director.
Thank you. My other question is about the MBDA. Your budget submission to Congress proposes eliminating the MBDA. It's the only federal agency tasked to create new jobs by expanding the U.S. economy through our nation's 8.1 million minority businesses. Based on current census data, it's estimated that by the year 2050, minorities will represent 54% of the total United States population. Minorities currently represent 29% of our population, but own only 7.5% of our nation's businesses. How can we ensure, if this agency is eliminated, that we're giving them the opportunities to grow? Minority-owned businesses are twice as likely to export their products and services, for example, as non-minority-owned businesses. My questions are, what message does the elimination of a program like this send to our minority communities across America? And how will this administration ensure that for minority-owned businesses that they have a level playing field in access to capital, contracts, and markets? Thank you.
Thank you. That's a very important question. The administration's general focus is trying to help everybody in the economy with the tax reductions, with the regulatory reductions, with unleashing our energy resources, and with getting rid of inappropriate trade practices. Our hope is that that will make a much better environment for all businesses, whether minority businesses or not. As to the MBDA itself, it is a relatively small entity, as you're aware, and a grant-making entity. And in general, those have been targets in this budget proposal. Small grant-making entities have been targeted. And part of the reason is there is some duplicative activity between the MBDA and the Small Business Administration in their district offices and in their small business development centers. But the President's proposal to eliminate the agency should not be viewed as an abandonment of the agency's core mission. Rather, it's in a strange way an acknowledgement that the agency has succeeded in creating an environment that's more supportive of minority businesses today than it had been before the agency was founded way back in 1969. So in a sense, that's a factor in it. But our hope is that the overall lift to the economy will make a lot more room for minority businesses and other small businesses.
Thank you for that. So, as you know, the SBA programs would address small businesses. Not all minority-owned businesses are necessarily small businesses. So I'm just concerned and would love to hear more details. And I appreciate you addressing issues like tax regulations and cutting down on regulations. I'm just concerned if the MBDA is eliminated, the 30-plus centers around the country are eliminated, the employees who won't be there in certain communities to be able to help minority communities, how outside of the SBA, if they don't fit into that category, how are we going to ensure that the core mission of the MBDA is fulfilled?
Well, as you know, there also are similar efforts at the state and local, and as well as private sector efforts to encourage minority business development. Presumably, those will go unabated by the demise, if it occurs, of the MBDA. Also, you probably are aware, I serve on the board of OPIC and of the Export-Import Bank, and I've been encouraging those two institutions very aggressively to help smaller businesses, and particularly minority businesses, because for only 2% of all American businesses ever export anything. And I think part of the reason is it's a daunting challenge to arrange foreign exchange transactions, letters of credit, all the things that are essential to international business. So I've been trying to get them to focus more on the small business situation in this country.
If I could, oh, sorry. If I could just finish by saying, if I could work with you and have your commitment on ensuring that our government is fulfilling the core mission of the MBDA as we work through this budget, working with the state and local governments to make sure they have the resources that they need.
Shirley, well, we had to make a lot of difficult decisions in this budget process, and this was one of the more difficult ones.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I know the University of Houston has a very successful program to coach and guide minority business owners, small businesses into the equity market, and I know you've got 55 years of experience
Yes, sir.
in this area, so
Yes,
it's
sir.
one that you know well.
Yes, sir.
I want to recognize Mr. Palazzo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Secretary. Thank you for being here today. Mr. Secretary, having been at least a part-time Florida resident, I think you understand very well that commercial and recreational fishing in state and federal Gulf of Mexico waters is very important to the national and our regional economies. And as everyone here knows, NOAA announced earlier this month that the recreational fishermen along the coast would have a mere 3 days to fish for red snapper in federal waters. Over the past decade, the recreational private sector has seen annual seasons reduced from 194 days in 2007 to just 11 days in 2016 to 3 days in 2017. Now, I'm not going to get in the weeds on this with things like total allowable catch or state versus federal data collection. I think my Gulf Coast colleagues and I have outlined those issues fairly extensively at this point in the several letters that we've sent you, your department, in 2017. I understand that in the absence of legislation, the agency's purview is limited. However, going forward, can you assure us that you will use whatever tools you have to provide some relief to our recreational anglers right now and down the road, work with Congress to develop a long-term solution to address these issues impacting our recreational fishermen and coastal communities?
I'm quite aware of the situation, and there was a letter sent by some 15 congressmen on the topic, led by Whip Scott. And just last night, Earl Comstock from my office, who's our director of policy, had a meeting with many of those members. I don't know, Mr. Palazzo, if you were
Yes, sir. I was in attendance.
part of it. I think there he pledged, and I pledge again, but we will try to make sure that there's an equitable solution to the conundrum of recreational fishing versus commercial fishing. but you're quite right in saying that our resources in the sense of powers is relatively limited in that area. So we are going to be making a very fulsome request of NOAA for the underlying data on which they base the decision just to give one 3-day weekend for recreational snapper catching. It seems on the skimpy side, but we're not the fish experts, so I promise you we will follow up and we will do the best we can to balance the needs of the recreational with the needs of the commercial.
Well, Mr. Secretary, I appreciate that, and I look forward to working with you and your team to help the recreational anglers be able to enjoy what pretty much, is their heritage and what they enjoy to do, and be able to get out on the waters and make memories that will last a lifetime.
Right.
So thank you, sir.
Well, when I was a little boy, my grandfather and I used to fish a lot, so I have a history as a recreational fisherman.
And you never forget those memories.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I want to express my agreement with Mr. Palazzo. This is a thorny issue. Red snapper's a tough issue, but 3 days are on the skimpy side, and the commercial fishermen have done a good job. The stocks are rebounding because there were reasonable limits put in place to protect red snapper, but there's certainly got to be a way to open up the federal waters to recreational fishermen in a way that will preserve the fishing stock. Maybe just limits the federal waters like you've got in the state waters.
Sure. Well, the fishing whole scene is very intriguing to me in that I'm obsessed with the problem that we have a $13 billion deficit, trade deficit in fish and fish products. And it doesn't seem to me, with all the water surrounding us and all the lakes and rivers, it seems weird that we should have a deficit. So that's one of the areas we're going to be focusing very much on. It's not directly on the point of recreational, but the whole fishing topic is very, very complex and very, very fascinating.
And especially important in the United States, as you say, with our coastal waters that are so prolific, and we've done a good job of protecting and managing those assets, and there's few people in Congress that know more about it than the former senator from Washington, who I'm pleased to recognize, Mr. Kilmer, who's very, very knowledgeable in this area, and we look to him and to Mr. Palazzo for advice on this.
Thanks. Thanks for being with us, Mr. Secretary. Before I came to Congress, I worked in economic development professionally, and I worked often with the only agency at the federal level whose sole purpose is economic development, and that's the Economic Development Administration. I represent a district that has a lot of areas that are really struggling. My hometown of Port Angeles is one of those distressed communities. And with the help of the EDA's Regional Innovation Strategies Program, just started up a composite recycling center in that town. With an investment of just $500,000, which is a drop in the bucket for the federal government, the recycling center is going to establish a new industry and bring much needed jobs into an area that needs it. And I am perplexed that the department would choose to eliminate one of the federal government's strongest supporters of job creation. I know that the rationale is stated as it being duplicative. I guess I would love to understand what programs is the EDA duplicative of, and what's the rationale for eliminating it?
Okay, well, thank you for that question. First of all, I'm proud of the investments that the EDA has made historically. I think the record over the last 52 years has been an exemplary record, both in terms of the help they've provided to distressed regions and of the way that the investments have turned out. I think it's been a very, very well-run program. And I think it's because they were locally driven strategies and needs that it succeeded as well as it did. And those investments did spur local innovation and entrepreneurship, save jobs, and leverage private investments. Now, the good news about the decision is that there will be a continuity of the administration of the grants because there is a large portfolio. It's some 1,400 grants are outstanding, and they total something on the order of $1 billion. So there's going to be a several-year period during which those will be administered. And that therefore will assure at least that the existing grantees are not left out in the cold. There will still be the relationship with them.
So who's going to fill the gap afterwards?
Well, I don't have a very easy answer for that, but there are other programs that at the state level and at the local level in a variety of communities that perhaps could fill some of that gap.
I'm just in the interest of time, I'll move on, but I would just say I think communities like the one where I grew up are looking to the federal government to be a partner in those efforts. Other areas that are looking to be partners are coastal communities. I represent the coast of Washington State. And I know you have a long background in business and can appreciate return on investment. The Coastal Zone Management Program and the Regional Coastal Resilience Grants are good examples of return on investment. In your own budget justification, it says over the 45-year history of the Coastal Zone Management Program, participating states and federal agencies have partnered to streamline permitting and regulatory processes, reduce the costs associated with disasters, and address environmental risks with potentially catastrophic economic impacts. By the most modest standard, they say that there's been more than 3-to-1 return on investment. I represent a district that is already dealing with the impacts of more severe storms, with sea level rise, with coastal hazards, including potential tsunami. So I have to say the elimination of these programs I think would be very pound foolish. I can't even say it's penny wise. I know our own chairman from Texas, there are 27 refineries representing 29% of the nation's refining capacity in Texas. Some of them are on the coast. A lot of them are. Countless ports. We have a lot of defense installations that are on the coast. 40% of the U.S. population lives in coastal areas. These programs actually help make our communities safer. They help us protect critical infrastructure. They help us shore up those national security assets. So can you explain to me and to our subcommittee why you believe NOAA's Coastal Zone Management and Coastal Resilience Program should be eliminated? Because I have to be honest, the justification that's in the budget I just don't find compelling at all.
Well, again, to get to the administration's priority goals, which were rebuilding the military and making critical investments in national security, there had to be an identification of savings that could be made in order to keep the nation on a responsible fiscal basis. And unfortunately, that requires some very difficult decisions to be made. I certainly agree with you. There's nothing inherently wrong with coastal zone management. It's not a criticism of the functions that they had performed, but you have to cut somewhere. And it seemed to us to be something of a lower priority than the core functions of NOAA, such as the surveys, the charting, and the fisheries management activities that they have. So it was a question of trying to rank priorities rather than any editorial comment against coastal zone management.
I would just mention, I think the Defense Department actually does a stupendous job of keeping us safe, but so do programs like this. They keep coastal communities safer. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I know we do record debt, the deficits at tremendous levels. The military's really does need to be shored up. I've heard, you probably heard the numbers. It's about 74% of the marine airplanes cannot be flown because of inadequate spare parts. About half of the Navy's planes are having difficulty staying in the air because of a lack of spare parts. So we really do have a critical problem with the nation's military at a time of crushing national debt that we just can't pass on to our kids. So it is going to be a really difficult budget year for all of us, and we're going to have to really work hard to be sure that our constituents' very scarce and hard-earned tax dollars are wisely spent and targeted, and to the extent we can find, with your experience in banking and equity, would look to your guidance to how we can ensure that minority businesses, small businesses, coastal communities, programs that were, see laid out in the president's budget, are there ways to shift those over to the private sector? So you'll be a good, we look for your guidance in that area and how we can save money. And an area that's also of a concern in terms of managing and focusing very precious and scarce hard-earned tax dollars is in NOAA's weather satellites. NOAA's 3 biggest weather satellite programs are slated to cost nearly $30 billion over the next 15 years. They're absolutely essential to the nation's economy, to protecting lives, to ensure that we can accurately forecast the weather. But this $30 billion price tag is, quite frankly, going to put intense pressure on the rest of the department's budget. As we move forward, Mr. Secretary, what options are you examining to reduce the cost of the weather satellite program while maintaining accurate and reliable forecasts?
Well, clearly the number one purpose is the accuracy and reliability of the forecast, so we don't want to compromise those activities at all. One of the things we're looking into is NOAA has done a good thing buying in bulk and getting some savings in the cost of satellites. Satellite is not like Navy fighter planes or Air Force planes where it's a big, long program that's going to go many, many years. These are pretty much custom designed, very limited market. And they have found that by bunching together a couple of purchases, they get a much cheaper price than they would have to pay if they just ordered one and then a couple years now ordered another one. And their statistics on that are pretty compelling. So even though it seems strange to order a thing years before you'll actually need to use it, they make a very good case that that actually does save, because the amortization of the special designs now goes over more than one unit rather than just have to be recovered in one single unit. What we are discussing with them, though, is what are the implications of the fact that the satellite lives now appear to be about 6 years longer than had previously been forecast. What are the implications that has for how much duplication do you really need? How much overlap do you really need? And we're trying to get our arms around that so that we can get a more precise thing. So it's good news that the lives are proving to be longer, because even if nothing else changes, that will mean longer period when we're safely going to have proper forecast. They already, but they are on schedule for the September 2017 launch. That's going to happen, and appear to be within their budget for. So at least the immediate present, there doesn't seem to be a big economic overrun. The one later is being postponed to 2003, so there's a little gap there. But I do think that they've done a pretty good job figuring out in what unit increments to make the orders so that they realize the price. You also, of course, have to be aware that there is a need for some redundancy, because there's always the danger of a catastrophic failure. And while that may only be a 1 or 2% probability, if it happens, then it's 100% probability. So that's a tricky thing for them to balance. And so far, it feels as though they're doing a pretty good job of it.
Since the GEOS T satellites are lasting longer, should we slow the pace of buying more GEOS satellites if the existing ones are lasting
that's
longer?
exactly the question I was just raising. That's something we're exploring with them. but there still is the danger of the catastrophic failure. There's also the danger of a launch failing. Now, they haven't really had that, but as you've seen, some of the private sector, SpaceX and things like that, have had some severe problems with launches. So it's a very complicated question, and my work so far with them has suggested they're doing a pretty good job balancing all of these variables.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Mr. Serrano.
Mr. Secretary, as you know, the Minority Business Development Agency was established by Republican President Richard Nixon. This agency received $34 million in the final fiscal year 2017. This is a successful program in locations around the nation, including in my district. Yet, the administration seems intent upon destroying it. In his signing statement on the Appropriations Act that we just concluded, President Trump asserted the provisions of this agency's appropriation would be treated, quote, in a manner consistent with the requirement to afford equal protection of the laws under the due process of the Constitution's 15th, unquote. Would you please explain this? In what ways will the department depart from the approach of previous administrations of both parties as far as implementation of the funding for the development agency? And secondly, did the White House or all OMB officials consult with you in advance about the president's signing statement?
As I say, it's not meant to be an editorial comment on the quality of the agency or the performance that it's had over the years. It simply is a question. There's a limited amount of funding. Very, very difficult decisions had to be made, very uncomfortable decisions. And we had to cut somewhere. And this seemed to be something that did not destroy the fundamental missions of the Commerce Department. If in an ideal world, we certainly would have preferred to keep it going, but we are in a stringent budget period.
I'm aware of that, Mr. Secretary, but my question further is, if you agree that in an ideal world we could keep it going, then what harm could it cause once we remove it? You know,
what harm could it cause once we remove?
When we remove it, you said that you don't see that it's it sounds to me like you say it's not that important to the ongoing operation of the Commerce Department, but yet it has value and a lot of
It does have value. There's no question about that. But what we're trying to do is to improve the whole economy for everyone. And by doing the tax reductions, the curtailment of inappropriate imports, unleashing the energy, all those measures are designed to make the economy better for everyone. So we're trying to do, on a macro scale, make less necessary functions on a micro scale to help things. If the economy gets stronger overall, everybody's businesses will be helped.
Let me move on to another area, Mr. Secretary. Again, we go to the census. The budget request to save money proposes to save money by scaling back several of the Census Bureau's most widely used surveys. For example, the budget will reduce the sample size of the Survey of Income Program Participation, or SIP. Now, the census collects a lot of information that a lot of Americans, I think, look at and say, why did we ask that question? And yet, it really is necessary because it speaks to who we are as a nation, what we are as a nation, what we have, what we don't have. You know, when we say the average American has whatever, 3 television sets or so on, that wasn't just made up. You know, there are people who work at that. Why get rid of that or scale back the SIP part of the form,
Well,
of the study, if you will?
the census, are you addressing the issue of the content of census?
Yes.
It's my understanding that there was a hearing in the Congress, a different committee from this one, on content, and that the final content of the census will be determined by next spring. I don't believe there's been a final determination as to what will be the content of the items, of the questions asked. What complicates it, though, is that the more questions you ask and the more subcategories within those questions, the lower the response rate tends to be, because people don't want to put an infinite amount of time to dealing with the census questions. So there's a balancing attempted between having maximum content and getting maximum response, because we're clearly better off to the degree we can get actual responses rather than interpolated or estimated responses. So it's a balancing act between response percentage and content.
I would just close this question by saying that I hope, as a person of your background, you keep an eye on this, because this is more important than we think. This gives us, or I've been told by census directors before, give us indications on economic trends and on situations that we need to know, and we need to know also.
Sure.
when we work. As you know, I'm sure you know, we work a lot with census information to make decisions. The best decision, I think, or the worst, is that's how they redraw our districts. But we're not going to discuss that painful one right now.
Well, over the years, I've been a very big consumer of data put out by the census, so I have a great deal of respect for it. And I'm very happy that they've done a lot of things to improve the accuracy of the preliminary forecast versus the revised ones. Because the preliminary forecasts are getting better and better as they find more and more reliable data sources on a timely basis. So I have a very keen appreciation of the importance of the census data. And I think they are the gold standard in the world for accuracy and for the breadth of content that they provide. I don't believe there's another country that does the census at all as well as we do, either in terms of breadth of content or accuracy.
One last question, Mr. Secretary. I've spent a lot of time in my 27 years here talking about a new relationship with Cuba. And we do have a new relationship, but it's not on the front page anymore, so a lot of people are wondering what that relationship is. Is the Commerce Department involved in any way in opening up Cuba and opening up the U.S. to Cuba in a way that we didn't do before?
Well, as I understand it, so far, the main opening up has been a number of hotel chains from the U.S. have made arrangements to operate facilities in Cuba. And that's probably one of the best things for that economy, in that it used to be a very big tourist economy, and then obviously that changed quite considerably during the difficult periods. So I think that's been the number one initiative so far, is the tourism initiative. And there has been consultation between the travel industry and parts of commerce on a very, very active basis. That's the main thing of which I'm aware at this point.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Arnold. Mr. Cartwright?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Ross, while the administration's general position on the cause of our changing climate flies in the face of science, we can agree that the Earth is warming and extreme weather events are occurring with more frequency. 2016 was the warmest year on record, and out of the last 17 years, fully 16 of them have been the warmest on record to date. Now, specific to your mission, sir, new scientific analyses find that the Earth's oceans are rising nearly 3 times as fast as they did during the 20th century. Sea level is not only real and an imminent threat, but it is accelerating. NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, has been gathering and analyzing climate and weather data since 1970. I appreciate that during your confirmation hearing, you said in regard to climate science that science should be left to the scientists. I can't tell you how much I appreciated hearing that. But the administration's budget proposal significantly decreases the funding that allows these scientists to do their essential work. You can't leave the work to the scientists, but not give them the resources they need to do that work. My first question relates to the administration's call for a 52% decrease in funding for its National Water Model, NWM. The NWM has proven significantly to improve flood forecasting. Now, with heavy downpours increasing across the nation, the need for accurate and timely flood forecasting is more important than ever. Why does the budget proposal reduce flood forecasting, which can help save lives and money, Secretary?
Well, you're right that the National Water Model has been reduced. Fiscal year 17 was at 6 million. Fiscal year 18, it was planned to be at 2.9 million. And the regional climate centers, fiscal 17, 3.65 million, fiscal 18, 650,000. These are level of effort activities. No centers are being closed. It was an affordability decision, not a policy decision.
You anticipated my next question, which is the RCCs, Regional Climate Centers. Actually, the administration's budget request is an 82% cut to the RCCs. Now, these have been around for more than 30 years, helping local communities on the ground work with National Centers for Environmental Information's data records and apply them to solving many real-world problems posed by climate change. Businesses and farmers rely on this information, the RCC data. What are they going to do when you cut this funding? Your budget states that, quote, with this reduction, NOAA will rely on state and local service providers to cover the necessary services, unquote. And that's a phrase that has been intoned several times in today's hearing. My question to that is, really? Who might it be that steps in and replaces this funding?
Well, as I indicated, no centers are being closed, so there is no region that will be left without a center. It's just the level of activity will be diminished somewhat. And within the levels of activity, they will try to prioritize the ones that are the most crucial.
Well, if the implication is we're going to push it off on the states. States have a state climatologist who generally has a very limited budget, and these state climatologists typically share and receive information with the RCC,
Right.
especially for regional concerns that affect larger tracts of geography than just one state. So again, who are these state and local service providers who can apparently fill the funding gap that you're creating?
I don't know that they will be able to fill the funding gap, but all that's happening is there's a little lower level of activity in each of these regions. No center is being closed. So the level of activity will go down considerably, but no one will be left without a center.
And I take it that the overall answer comports with what you've been saying today, that the big reason for all of these cuts is that we must cut.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. We're in a very stringent period, and with the big increases in defense and military and national security, cuts have to be made somewhere.
I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Cartwright. We are indeed in an era of $20 trillion in debt, extraordinary annual deficits. We have to find areas where we can save money, and I'd welcome your suggestions, my colleagues, where else we might find savings within our jurisdiction, and appreciate very much your work in that area, Ms. Secretary. There is undoubtedly somewhere we can save some money within the Department of Commerce. Ms. Secretary, I really appreciate your service. I've got a number of other questions that I'll submit for the record for you to answer in writing. And
Surely.
any other questions, of course, which Mr. Serrano or you want to submit, we'll submit those to you for your response at a later time. Above all, I want to thank you for your service to our country and for your time here today, sir, and we look forward to working with you to find savings to make sure that we spend our constituents' very scarce and hard-earned tax dollars wisely and frugally.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, ranking member and member.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. The hearing is adjourned.